Welcome to Banyan Books, Branches of Wisdom, celebrating the joy of bright ideas and heartful lifelong learning. Branches of Wisdom is a series of intimate conversations with the world's most influential authors and visionaries. We explore spirituality and the human mind, ecology and culture. Most episodes are recorded with a live audience. You can join our live events and submit questions to your favorite guests. Check out our upcoming schedule at banyan.com. Since 1970, Banyan Books has been a rich oasis at the crossroads of wisdom and philosophy, offering resources for humanity's evolving paths. We're a locally owned, independent bookstore in the heart of Vancouver's Kitsilano neighborhood. Visit us in person or shop online at banyan.com. Please subscribe, follow, like, and leave your reviews for the podcast. And now, enjoy.
Welcome to tonight's event with Rob Wipond in conversation with Rudy Liebig about Rob's new book, Your Consent is Not Required: The Rise in Psychiatric Detentions, Forced Treatment, and Abusive Guardianships. My name is Jacob Steele, the events manager for Banyan Books. I would like to begin, first of all, by acknowledging that although we have participants that join from around the world for these events, the physical location of Banyan Books is on the unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, including the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. If you enjoyed today's event, we invite you to donate to Banyan Books to help support these programs to be free and accessible for all. There's a PayPal donation link in the video description below. Rob Wipond welcomes your questions. Please type questions into the chat box at any point during the event. Now for introductions. Rob Wipond is a freelance investigative journalist who writes about the intersections of psychiatry, civil rights, policing, surveillance, and social change. His work has been nominated for 17 magazine and journalism awards for reporting on science, medicine, law, business, and community issues. Rudy Liebig is a retired educator with a long-time interest in addressing widespread abuses and traumas resulting from the psychiatric system and creating a more humane and healing response to mental health struggles. Tonight, they will be speaking on Rob's new book, Your Consent is Not Required: The Rise in Psychiatric Detentions, Forced Treatments, and Abusive Guardianships. It's an important topic, and I'm very grateful that we are able to platform it this evening. Please give a warm welcome to Rob Wipond and Rudy Liebig. Thank you.
Thanks, Jacob.
Hey.
Hi, Rob.
Hey, Rudy. Good to see you. I can see you.
Yes.
I wish I could see who else is attending with us tonight. Hopefully they'll put in some comments so we can get a feel for who's out there.
Yeah, this is great. Okay, well, I think I'll start. I'm going to be asking you some questions tonight and letting you share your extensive wisdom and the research that you've done over the past 20 years. We're particularly talking about issues around mental health, psychiatry, forced treatment, medication, and this type of thing. And I want to say that your book, Your Consent is Not Required, has had a tremendous amount of meaning for me as someone with lived experience. And reading it has really helped me to have a deeper understanding of my own experiences and the context of the whole system that these experiences took place in. In your book, you do a beautiful job of giving voice to a very diverse range of people who have experience with being involuntarily detained in psychiatric institutions and undergoing various kinds of forced medication and forced treatment. I would love it if you could just begin by talking about what is forced treatment for people who may be coming to this issue without a lot of personal experience, or maybe aren't that familiar with it. So what is forced treatment? What is involuntary treatment? And could you also share some of the stories of people that you've encountered as you've worked in this issue?
Thank you for the question, and thank you for doing this interview with me tonight, Rudy. I appreciate it. And yeah, as you know from the book is very much populated by the voices of people who've personally been through these experiences. Not only them, but I interview other types of experts, psychiatrists, medical staff, lawyers, and all sorts of other people who interface with the mental health system. But really, at the core of it is people's direct personal experiences that they recount to me. And then I often, when I had the ability, would look at their medical records and talk to their families and other things to sort of corroborate parts of their stories if I could. And yeah, that's a huge part of it, because often we don't hear that voice. And so I think a lot of people have a picture of forced treatment or involuntary commitment as something sort of like this. We're worried about you, we're upset about you, we're concerned. Unfortunately, yes, we need to keep you here in the hospital now because of that concern. But hey, let's talk. What's going on for you? And how can we help you? Like, I think people maybe imagine that. And it's not that that never happens. And unfortunately, we don't have great data about what's really happening out there. And that's one of the things I explore in the book, and we'll return to that in a bit. But essentially, a much more common experience from what I've been able to find and what the research seems to show is it's a much more intimidating, threatening, even physically assaultive experience. So it may start already in your home or on the street, wherever you happen to be. The police, it's an interface. Someone has called doing a wellness check, and that person who's making the call might actually be truly concerned about you, but they don't know what's going to typically happen. So typically the police will show up, and the police may or may not be trained to deal with such a situation. It can be very threatening, very scary already, especially if you are, in fact, in a very distressed state prior to them arriving. Then you'll be taken to the hospital, often handcuffed along the way. Things play out from there. This may have heightened your anxiety if you were already experiencing anxiety. So now you may be panicking if you don't know what it's like that even this could happen. And a lot of people, it's their first time. The best data we have in the US shows that people may only have this happen very rarely in their lives. And so those people can be terrified by this experience. So then they may want to run. They may be like, what's happening? I want a lawyer. Well, in most jurisdictions, you're not allowed a lawyer. It's not at this stage. And so they just take that as an expression of some sort of like panic on your part, and they try to control you. They're trying to stop this. And so it can become a very confrontational experience very rapidly. There are security guards at hospitals. They'll physically overcome people. They'll strap them to restraining beds, 4-point restraints. They can be forcibly injected, forcibly stripped. A lot of things can play out from here if you're putting up any resistance at all. So yeah, it can be really threatening. And even when you're not, they can still be very, very confrontational and threatening in their approach. A lot of people find it very unpleasant, even if they're not putting up resistance. And then this plays out over time. So this is just, we're describing like the involuntary hold, the sort of emergency intervention process. Now you're there for a while. And in that setting, often it's just a very dismal, uninteresting hospital environment. There's a public room, like a lobby area where people are milling about watching television, perhaps. You may not have any kind of privacy or private room, and it can just really not seem like a very therapeutic environment. It's really just a typical hospital in that sense. So it's not like in Canada anyway, they're not usually decrepit facilities per se, but neither are they nice, warm, welcoming environments. They can be sort of sterile. And so that actually can heighten and amplify people's depression or anxiety in different ways. So that's a kind of overview. And yes, we have lots of evidence to suggest people's testimonies that this can be a very traumatizing experience. It is not at all uncommon to hear people compare it to being sexually assaulted. And in fact, many people I've spoken with who've personally actually experienced sexual assault or childhood abuse will say, my experience in a psychiatric hospital being voluntarily detained was worse. And I think this is something really our culture needs to grapple with, that this is not an uncommon statement at all. And so what does that mean? And it's really, really traumatizing for many people. When we talk about it being a civil rights concern, yes, it's that. And I talk a lot about that in my book, but it's something more than a civil rights concern. This is an abuse concern. And again, I want to emphasize, not for everybody, not all the time. This play out in so many different ways for different people, but there are a huge chunk of the population, a large percentage of people that describe experiences like this and say it was one of the worst and most terrifying experiences of my life.
Could you touch on a few of the experiences that you describe in your book? Some of the, like, just to give the people who are listening an idea of the diversity of people who find themselves in these circumstances?
Well, that's one of the reasons I do think everybody should be concerned about this. Is there's this broadening use of these laws against an enormously diverse range of people. I can give some examples even from British Columbia, because I lived and worked in British Columbia for 20 years. And a lot of my initial learnings about this were centered in British Columbia. So, for example, I mean, one of the cases I cover in the book was a person who was experiencing stress and anxiety as a result of his work. He was exposed to people who were in emergency situations as a volunteer in emergency rescue. And so he sometimes had these memories coming up and experienced anxiety. And so he checked himself in to a local hospital in Vancouver, actually asking for help. And the story goes back and forth, but essentially at some point he's waiting in a room he says, I don't really want drugs. I've tried them before. I didn't find them helpful. I'd like some therapy. I'm wondering if there's someone who would talk with me about therapy. So he's made it very clear he does not want drugs. Well, little does he know, as he's waiting, then the doctors are talking. They decided that his refusal to accept drugs is an indication that he's somehow even more mentally ill than he's saying. And they send in the security team, and he doesn't know what's going on. So he's me like, no, I came here voluntarily. I want to leave. They don't let him leave. A confrontation occurs. He's now panicking. They're assaulting him. They cut off his clothes with scissors. They forcibly inject him. They drag him into seclusion. They leave him restrained there. It's just an absolutely terrifying and brutal experience for him. And he ended up actually suing because his relative was a lawyer. And so a lot of this gets laid out in the court case. And it's not that anything I described to you was in any way denied by the doctors, in fact, and they portrayed it as fairly typical. So, this is something that everybody should be considering. As you see, this was not somebody living on the street. This was not somebody, who was chronically mentally ill and severely deranged. This was not somebody who had no insight. All these sort of cliches we hear out there about the only kind of people we forcibly treat. This was somebody from a much more ordinary kind of background, just genuinely having some troubles and looking for help. So that's the kind of a story that I describe in the book a lot.
Yeah, and I think you also do a very good job of covering the diversity of people who are having these experiences. Like you've just said there, it's a very wide range of people, of ages, of backgrounds, and that these experiences are much more common and affecting many, many more people than one would have the understanding of if you're just looking at the mainstream media or getting coverage of these issues. And which is one of the things about this issue is there's so much silence on it, which is why I think your book is especially important, because you are letting people's stories be heard.
Yeah. And that's one thing I really want to highlight a lot is we kind of only hear about these extreme cases of people, and they're real. It's not that there's nobody like this. There are people who maybe they've gone through childhood abuse, maybe they've gone through addiction, maybe they're living on the street, they're poor, maybe they're not getting any sleep out there because they're living on the street, maybe they're using drugs now, right? They can get into some really strange states when for periods of time, they might be threatening. So that does happen to people, but those are the only people largely that we're hearing about in most cases. And what I want to highlight is actually, those kind of people, and people are often saying, how can you write your book, Rob, about these other cases when those are the dominant cases? And actually what I find, and we do have some studies showing this, is these are not the people who are getting involuntarily treated a lot in a lot of cases, because hospitals don't want to deal with them. They become known to the hospitals. They become known to the police over time. And they know, we can't help you. Like, you need housing, you need regular daily supports, you need a lot more than we can give you. We can give you a drug. We can lock you up for a little while. Eventually, you don't meet the criteria anymore. We let you go, and you're basically back to the street, and it's not easy out there. So you're probably going to do drugs again. You're probably going to have, and they know this. And so they often don't even want to deal with these people. And so largely, especially outside of major cities where homelessness isn't such a big problem, outside of there, it's a much different type of person who will typically end up in an involuntary commitment situation. And it's those cases that I describe in the book. So, for example, one of the things that's happened is also happening in British Columbia. The representative for children and youth there, just a few years ago, did a study of it and found that the rates of involuntary commitment of children and youth were skyrocketing in British Columbia. And really the reason for that, and we've got other places we can get some good data too, like in Florida, there's some great data on this, and a few other states where we can see that it's the school system. So schools are predominantly using involuntary commitment as a punishment tool, a control tool, and a helping tool. They're using it as all three. So if a child is misbehaving in class, they may genuinely be thinking, hey, I really want to help that kid, so I'm going to call 911, get the police to take him to the psychiatric hospital. Or I really can't control this kid anymore and he's actually threatening. I'm going to call 911, get him hauled up to the psychiatric hospital. And this is not a rare occurrence. Right now, in the data we're seeing, wherever we can get good data, the fastest growing population of people being involuntarily committed is children and youth. Another one where I found it's very, very common, and particularly in British Columbia. British Columbia has some of the highest rates in the country, and Canada has far higher rates than the United States, and that is nursing homes. So here we see, and I'm talking now, when I talk about the rates, I'm talking there about the use of antipsychotic drugs to tranquilize elderly people who are, maybe they have a bit of dementia or maybe they don't. It's become a preferred tool for kind of controlling and managing nursing homes, which may be understaffed, which may be underfunded in some way. That may contribute to this issue, but it's more than that. It's definitely become part of the culture of treatment of elderly people in our society, to put them on these heavy, heavy tranquilizing medications as a control mechanism. And so when there's any resistance to that, they utilize mental health laws to do it.
And can you you were starting to talk there about why British Columbia is unique in that way. Can you touch on that a bit?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting thing that I learned as I worked on the book that I didn't actually know when beforehand. So I had been researching these issues for quite a long time as a journalist, a regular working journalist in British Columbia. I did not know until I was working on the book that British Columbia is really the cutting edge of involuntary commitment in North America. And I subsequently spoke with a top American expert in mental health law who had also spent some time living in Canada and had looked at the laws here. And he agreed with me, and he said, British Columbia seems to be ahead of everybody. And by head, I mean our laws are the most aggressive in North America already, and have been for a very long time. So this is important for people to know when they're trying to contextualize what's happening socially and politically, because even now as we speak, in British Columbia, there's strong movement on to expand involuntary commitment even more. We want to more aggressively treat people who are using substances and so on. And there's this assumption out there. It's like, we hardly ever do this. And and what I found is, okay, first of all, the laws are very, very broad in British Columbia. And basically it states that people think that it's only if you're a danger to yourself or others. And that's still on the books. That is true. If you're a danger to yourself or others as a result of having a mental disorder, then you can be detained under the Mental Health Act. Danger itself is very broadly and loosely defined. It really isn't defined at all. It's pretty much what a judge, what a lawyer, what a psychiatrist decides it is. But that's not the limit of the law. Then it's an or if you're at risk of mental or physical deterioration. What does that mean? No one really knows. It's never really been tested in law. So again, it largely means whatever a psychiatrist says it means, what a judge decides it means. And I say judge, but actually in Canada, in most jurisdictions, you never see a judge in the process. You'll see a tribunal, which is appointed by the government. So they may not even have a very extensive legal background in this area to even assess what the laws really mean or what the precedents are in this area. So British Columbia has these very broad laws. Then you add to it that part of our law is that you can be detained and forcibly medicated without any kind of hearing for up to 3 weeks, or you can be actually forcibly electroshocked in that period of time, which my own father was in British Columbia, which I talk about in the book. So you can be treated basically in any way that psychiatrists might want to treat you for a 3-week period before you even get an opportunity legally for a hearing in front of a tribunal. So that's largely unprecedented across North America. In other jurisdictions, usually it has to be an actual emergency for them to justify forcibly treating you before you get a hearing, because typically a hearing would be to test whether you not have the competence to make decisions. BC has gotten rid of anything requiring any kind of test of your competence. Basically, if you're determined mentally ill and that they think they can lock you up, they think they can also forcibly treat you. So that's on the books as well. Also, they specifically wrote out of BC law any ability to appeal to an advance directive or a substitute decision maker. In other provinces and states, for example, if this happens to you, they can, you have the option then to say, okay, well, if you don't think I'm capable of making decisions, here's my partner, here's my friend, here's someone I trust who can represent me and make decisions for me.
Or having something like a Ulysses clause or an advance directive where you can say what you would want to have happen.
That's right. You in other jurisdictions, you sometimes have the ability to say, if I'm ever detained in this way, here's what I'd like to happen. In British Columbia, they explicitly forbade that under the Mental Health Act. Well, they actually wrote it into the other law, but in any case, it's forbidden under the mental health law. And so, yeah, this is huge power they have in British Columbia to implement forced treatment and involuntary commitment, and they utilize it. The rates in British Columbia are very high when we look at it compared to other jurisdictions, and they've been rising steadily since the 1980s or 90s when we have good data. Prior to that, of course, when we had large asylums, people were locked up often for years at a time. That doesn't happen anymore. But since the 80s or 90s, we've had a model roughly like we have today, and we can see the rates of detention going up steadily.
Okay. Before we go into some of the, some of the solutions that you write about and talk about, I'd like to ask a few more questions about the current state of things. One is that we're seeing now, both here in British Columbia, but certainly down in the States, and where we're seeing formerly progressive states such as New York, California, passing legislation that makes it increasingly easy to to involuntarily detain and to treat with, as you said, medications and using electroshock treatment, to be able to do this even more easily. And I'm wondering, and this isn't just places like California and New York, it's many states right now, and we're seeing a push for this type of thing across Canada. And I'm wondering if you can comment on why this is happening now, and so what some of the motivators are for this, or where's the
Yeah.
impetus for this?
It's very clear that we have a housing affordability crisis across North America, and governments are not dealing with it. We can trace this, really. We can trace the rise of this problem. Actually, the closure of asylums had virtually nothing to do with it. Most of the asylums were closed by the 70s, almost entirely by the 80s. And there was this was not a crisis back then. And we've seen studies that have actually tracked the closure of asylums and traced the people over a 15-20-year period. In fact, one of these studies was done in British Columbia. Everywhere they've been done, they've found that most of those people did not end up homeless. They did not end up in jail. Where they ended up was group homes, long-term care facilities, smaller facilities of different kinds, and so on and so forth. There was a move to create smaller types of facilities. And if you look at the numbers of those kinds of facilities, you see that they did largely replace the asylums. And in fact, I look at the numbers in my book and show that we seem to have more beds today. So what's happening in these large cities right now is they do have a homelessness problem. That's clear. And it's largely caused by affordability and the lack thereof. And so, of course, yes, that directly impacts more likely people who might be struggling in other areas of their life, who might, for whatever reason, be poorer. Maybe they do have some mental health challenges that were managed just fine prior to them becoming so poor they couldn't afford their apartment. Now they're living in the street, and this just escalates all of the problems they might have been having, So governments are trying to basically blame homeless people for being homeless. This is in some ways a somewhat cheaper excuse than really looking at the root causes to say, okay, look, we really have to reinvest in housing, as I was meant to say earlier, so we can also track how governments gradually at the provincial level, at the federal level, in both the US and Canada, got out of investing in subsidized housing really for decades now. It's largely been worse, and that has precipitated this kind of housing crisis. Also, of course, in places like Vancouver, most large cities that we're talking about in New York and California have gotten extremely expensive. They're the most expensive places in the continent. So as a result, we have this sort of extreme problem playing out. And so the notion of it all being the caused by the people themselves with their quote unquote mental illnesses is an exaggeration, and really just an attempt to kind of divert attention from more structural, bigger problems around the economy, affordability, wage levels, welfare levels, and things like that. Definitely supportive housing has a really important role to play in all this around the country, and we could talk about that. But overall, housing alone for a lot of these people would be just a great step up.
Well, that brings up a question of, there's a term we all hear all the time of like the dangerous mentally ill. And I think we're all very familiar with these kinds of stories. And it obviously ramps up fear tremendously on the part of the general public of the mentally ill. So there is a lot of just heightened fear, and people feeling, I think, more inclined to feel like, yeah, just round them up and put them somewhere away from us. Can you talk about what you found in your research about the actual link between mental illness and violence?
Yeah, so a lot of my book does challenge mainstream and conventional beliefs, and I try to present the research and data and stories that back that up. But this one, no. So everyone knows, like anyone that's ever looked at the issue of mental illness and violence knows that actually if you've been labeled with a mental disorder, overall, you're more likely to be a victim of violence than you are to be a perpetrator. An average person in the general population is more likely to be a perpetrator of violence. You're certainly no worse. You may be equal. You're probably less likely to be an act of violence. Now, what's happening is we have to largely blame it on media coverage and then politicians who like to exploit this. Certainly, it makes for an amazing, dramatic, sensational story of some kind. And it's a tragedy. It's terrible when these kinds of events happen, when something happens on the street with somebody who's maybe genuinely been struggling and they do something violent. And this can make all sorts of news coverage. But if you actually look at the numbers and the rates of this, of course, it doesn't even compare. It's not even on the radar radar of the types of things that people are most likely to die from or even be killed from in most cities in North America that just don't get attention. Car crashes being one of the most obvious examples of that. The rate of car crashes in an average city or near an average city, and the number of people who get severely injured or die from them are, so exponential. But what I will say is this: there is a subpopulation that does present a certain risk, and it's almost directly linked to substance use. Alcohol being the biggest precipitator. Like if you look at violence data across North America, something like it's an astronomically high number. So I won't try to remember it offhand. People will probably get inflamed if I do, but you can find this data relatively easily online. It's a very, very high percentage of people who commit murders were using alcohol at the time. Almost across the board with violent crimes. So it's not related. So substance use, particularly alcohol use, is linked to violence. And so sometimes there's an overlap between people maybe who also have a mental disorder, a psychotic diagnosis of some kind, something like that, who may be using these substances. And so those people will be more likely, mainly because of the use of alcohol or some other addictive substance in their lives, they'll be more likely than an average person to commit an act of violence. And certainly, that's an issue. And I don't want to say it's not an issue, but we have such a distorted view of it now. We're not responding to that issue well at all, right? We've got this very distorted view that is very prejudicial against people labeled with mental illnesses.
Well, I think we can all look around and see that so many people today are being diagnosed with mental illnesses. It's become more and more common, and more people are being put on psychiatric medication. And I'm wondering if you could comment on the role that profit plays in things like hospitalizations and people being put on medication, and that whole area of the money being made.
Yeah, and this was interesting about in the book. I compare the United States and Canada in this way. And certainly we know it's occurring in the United States. In fact, the New York Times just covered a huge story, without disclosing that this had actually been going on for over a decade. I actually reported on some of those hospitals myself in the book, but they reported on Acadia, which was the second largest healthcare psychiatric hospital chain in America, who were deliberately, this is according to the settlement with the Department of Justice, was basically accused of incarcerating people en masse for profit, and that people who were not actually meeting the criteria for involuntary commitment, nevertheless, they were being held. And so they had examples like that I was describing earlier, people actually showing up at the hospital, because they saw an advertisement for get a free depression test, find out if you're depressed. And they would show up to take the test, and they'd end up locked up in the hospital for a couple of weeks, forcibly drugged, forcibly treated, and build their insurance program or Medicare or Medicaid bilked during this time. And so this was being done en masse for profit, and they ultimately settled with the Department of Justice for about $20 million. And that was on the heels of one with Universal Healthcare, which was the biggest psychiatric hospital chain in America, who'd settled for about $100 million for doing the same thing. This is a mass scale, widespread problem. Now, what I like to remind people, certainly in Canada, because we don't have the extent of privatization in our system, that doesn't mean that our hospitals are not still running on a bottom line. They often are. And every body in a bed is still income for that hospital. And so it's quite possible this is going on here. And one of the things we don't have is the kind of litigious environment that they have in the United States. So these kinds of lawsuits rarely happen at all in Canada on any issue of malpractice at any scale. There's very little fighting, and there's a lot of reasons for that around how funding models work in Canada, and obviously our universal health care system, our public health insurance, so on and so forth. Nevertheless, we do see more concern I have around nursing homes and group homes, because they are, many more of them are privatized in Canada. And so this kind of model is kicking in, because we do know that it's very much a problem in the United States again, because they do the investigating there. The Department of Justice is quite aggressive in some ways around these issues. We don't have the equivalent of the Department of Justice in Canada that kind of looks at healthcare issues in that way. Like, they have an actual healthcare fraud division. To my knowledge, that doesn't even exist in Canada. Historically, we rarely sue pharmaceutical companies or healthcare institutions for anything.
Yeah, well, I think before we are going to be opening up to questions for people who are listening, who want to have you, Rob, answer questions or address any issues related to these topics. Before we move on to that, I wanted to make sure that you have time to talk about what is your vision for a healthy way of dealing with mental health crisis. What are some examples of either programs you've seen that do work, or just your vision, or signs of optimism that you've come across?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think it's a great segue actually into hearing from other people as well. So what I'd like to say about that is, I do look at sort of alternative approaches, and there are many. The core problem we have here right now is the involuntary commitment system, and really the hospital system. In Canada, it's actually worse than in the United States. Our public system mainly funds only medicalized responses in these environments. So if you think you're going to get robust counseling and therapy options, alternative therapeutic techniques, Gestalt, or anything like that up at a psychiatric hospital, you're gonna really have a traumatizing experience when you discover that no, that is not even on the radar up there at all. You'll be lucky if you find a doctor who allows you to not be on powerful psychiatric medication, let alone that has some sort of training or education or willingness to kind of try some sort of alternative approach here. And that's so ironic in a way, because across our culture, and Banyan Books is a great symbol of that, right? There's actually enormous popularity around intensive psychotherapeutic interventions of different kinds, like breathing techniques, yoga, and some of these techniques have actually been tested in emergency environments. So, of course, community-based approaches of different kinds. One of the best ones is just someone else who's been through that experience before, a peer who can be there at your side, who's maybe on staff for the hospital or with the police, or a mobile crisis team of some kind, who can say, "Hey, I've been where you've been. Let's talk," and just has an engagement with that person, tries to engage. That can be enormously effective at sort of calming people down, getting them rooted again, and just connecting with others. You ask them, who are your friends? Who else could we call at this time that might help you feel a little better about what's happening for you right now? Things like that are there's actually robust evidence. Open dialogue is an amazing
Yes, that's what I was going to say. It brings to mind open dialogue in Finland, which is an incredible thing for people to look into. It's been amazingly successful. And I'm also thinking of hotlines that have been run in various places by various different communities that have also been incredibly successful, where often having someone to speak to in a non-judgmental, calm way, and often if that person has lived experience, that these have been proven to be so incredibly helpful. Yet one thing you write about is a growing trend towards having these national, like mental health hotlines that people are encouraged to call. And I was wondering if you could touch on that a little bit before we, because I'm feeling like there's so many issues, but I'd love for you to talk just a little bit about that.
Just briefly, people can look at my writing. We have some links for that on that. But yes, just briefly, because you're right. There are some great hotlines out there, but people need to be aware that 988 in Canada, all of the lines that are participating in that, they have a policy of tracing calls and sending out police on a lot. So it's happening, and it looks like the rates have actually doubled since the implementation of 988, that the people that this is happening, the police will show up at your door and haul you up to the psychiatric hospital. So they're not confidential. You need to know that. They don't disclose this very clearly at all. The criteria around when it happens and why are very, very amorphous and poorly understood and poorly applied. It's definitely not if you're just in the act of suicide. It's if they think you might in some time in the near future take your own life. So very amorphous definition. So and they're also recording all calls now, it looks like, and sharing that data for AI development. It's just a mess what's happening there. I've written about it extensively, and I encourage people to go to PsychForce report now, the link there for that, where I've sort of done some updates, and also madinamerica.com. They've been supportive of my journalism in that area. But yeah, let's segue out to maybe bring Jacob on and try some of the comments and questions from people.
Well, thank you so much for bringing this knowledge to the world, making it seen. There's a question from David. Do we underestimate how language, words like help or treatment, can mask coercion?
Oh my God, yes. Thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, that's huge. I was just looking at a press release from the BC government yesterday about, involuntary commitment, and it's all couched in that. Like you read it, even I, after, everything, I'm going, wow, it sounds really sweet and nice and lovey what they're just trying to help these, sweet people. And I'm sure that for a lot of people, that is the intention, I'm sure, but it's not the way the system is playing out for so many people. And at the very least, I'd just say we need to be honest about that. Like it's not that it's never motivated by care, and it's not that it's never that the staff really are caring and nice. Yes, that does happen, and that's great when it does. And when it happens, people often say, you know what, I did have a positive experience. I did get some help. I did get grounded. That does happen, and I want to acknowledge that. But we have to be more honest as a culture collectively that, yes, we are lying to ourselves a lot, extensively, and not acknowledging the pain and trauma and suffering that involuntary commitment and forced treatment are causing so many people, like so many. It is not hard to find these people at all, I got to tell you. And my inclination, we don't have great data. This is one of my biggest protests. I'm saying, if you support involuntary commitment, get me the data. Put pressure on governments, because they don't collect data anywhere in North America on how many people is it happening to. Even that's hard to get. Who are they? Are they getting better? Are they getting worse? Are they being traumatized? Are they being healed? We just don't know this. Nobody's studying it. It's just like, these press releases are put out, people tell their personal story, and that's all we're working with right now. We're not working with science in this field at all. And so I say, if you're for involuntary commitment, you're in agreement with me. We need more data. That's what I'd say. That's what I want to hear you say. And yeah, thank you for that question. Gosh.
There's a question from Christine. She says, I know a number of people with substance use disorder who live on the street. Do we know what the criteria will be for committing people to involuntary treatment?
In British Columbia, I read the guidance that just came out yesterday, the day before, maybe even today, I'm not sure, but I read it in full. I was interested, written by a doctor. And actually, so there's been no change in the mental health legislation. And the guidance, in my opinion, hewed close to the current Mental Health Act. So the doctor clearly informed himself appropriately as to what it actually says, had, I think, probably talked with got some legal advice about it. And I think from the standpoint of saying, is it representative of the current laws? I'd say, yes, it is. So if a doctor reads that and goes, what am I legally allowed to do or not do around substance use in particular, I think it's fairly clear. The problem is it's not clear in the end. Is it still in this hazy gray area? When can you do it or not? Because it ultimately does come down to things like, are they deteriorating or not? And what does that mean? And who's going to decide? And is the mental disorder causing the substance use or not? Because technically, we're not supposed to be arresting people just because they use substances, right? You can smoke, you can drink. If that's your decision, you're allowed to do that. What are the criteria by which we go, no, you're not allowed to do that? We're going to say that whatever your substance you're using, you're not allowed to use it anymore, even though all these other people are. And that's the sort of line they're trying to work. And it's very hard to do that, actually. So what do we know? We don't know. We just know that individual doctors are going to be free to apply it the way they want. Tribunals will kind of make the decisions the way they want. And that's why I want to even like affirm people out there might be saying, oh, Rob, you're exaggerating. Lots of people who are so ill are never going to get help. And I'd say, yeah, I know. And that's often because ones who don't need it are getting it. Ones that do don't, or whatever, however you want to use these terms. I don't like to use the word need because I'm not sure anyone needs to be forcibly treated. But I just say, by and large, it's very much random almost. Like it's not, you can't predict who's going to get locked up and who's not. And that's one of the main themes of my book around this is that it's very unpredictable what's actually going to happen. And it largely has to do with how many beds are there, what's the attitude of the doctor, that sort of thing.
Rebecca has a question that kind of touches on some of the similar things. In a system that can override consent, who gets to define sanity and who benefits from that definition?
Yeah, great question. Wow. Yeah, and really in a large way, that's what my whole book's exploring. And that's where we interface with why I object. Like my father went through this experience and I described that in my book, and he was very traumatizing for him. He never recovered from it really. And in my opinion, he totally did not need to be treated that way at all. It's very humiliating for him. So, but another reason that I personally really care about these issues, because I have a background in doing holotropic breath work, I experimented in lots of ways as a youth and meditation techniques and alternative approaches to understanding life. And I consider myself sort of a fundamentally spiritual person. I like to be awake to what's happening in my mind and sensitive to it. And yeah, I go through difficult times and great times and I embrace them all, and I like having people in my life who are like that as well. And this involuntary commitment really strikes at some of those people, because if you're in that kind of a state, if you're going into a non-ordinary state, if you're going into an extreme state of some time, which for some of us might be called a spiritual awakening, this system can often step in, particularly if anyway you're in the wrong place at the wrong time, or surrounded by the wrong people who do not respect and value and support this, or if you become afraid in some way of what's happening to you. And in fact, one of the first stories in my book is about a person like that. He was a logger who went into an altered state, which is profoundly spiritual for him. But then fear came up and he walked out into the street and started doing some weird stuff, even though he had otherwise a professional person. He was in this altered state. He ended up with police intervening and his life went fully off the rails. So yeah, at that point, who is defining what's sane, what's insane, what's allowable and appropriate? And even more important, I say, what we as a culture are going to support and embrace. In some cultures historically, when people went into these kinds of altered states for whatever reason that were very profound, often a community would rally around them. An indigenous woman that I include in my book said that's the story she heard, that in her community, they'd put you in the big house and everybody would rally around and make food for you and support you and do chanting and dancing, celebrating the ancestors who were going to come in and help you in this difficult time. But instead, she got locked up and isolated in a psychiatric hospital. So yeah, again, who's defining that? Right now, psychiatrists are. And I find they're not very well trained. They're medically trained. They're not trained in non-ordinary states of consciousness. And so they approach this kind of stuff merely, they see it, they think it's an illness. It's brutal.
S. Gray has a question. What of various forms of dementia? What is a possible continuum of care to avoid over-medication early in treatment?
There's a lot of studies on that. So in fact, they've done some pilot projects even in Canada and Alberta. In fact, they did one not so long ago where the antipsychotic prescribing rates in nursing homes were so high, they took like about 6 nursing homes and worked with them on utilizing alternative techniques. And usually that's just instead of just intervening with the drug right away, try talking with the person, reassure them, bring them gently back to their room, talk about something that they've shared with you that they enjoy. Whatever, it's these kinds of things, right? Have appropriate staff trained to do this, right? And then, most importantly, if you've put them on the drug, monitor them regularly. And when they're stable, start slowly reducing the drug carefully. And that's not done at all, generally speaking. Often they put you on the drug. If you're stable, they say, well, that's good enough for us, and they'll never take you off again. At that point, your body starts to become dependent on it, becomes really hard to get people off, and so on and so forth. But there's lots of studies around the world on alternative approaches with dementia in particular.
I have a question as I'm listening to you talk. It seems like in so many different fields, like we've progressed so much, like we've, say in childcare, like the schools that my kids go to now, they have so much anti-bullying, like we're so progressive in so many ways now. But why is this area so stuck in the past? Like, why hasn't it evolved?
So
it's a great question.
One of the things I like to highlight is that an interesting and in some ways terrible and threatening thing is happening is actually, if you go into the school system, they get extensive training now. There are school programs across Canada for educating teachers, administrators, and children and youth on mental health issues. And they often start out great. I read these courses, the first sort of 10 pages are like, talk with each other, support each other. Here are some coping strategies you can try. The problem is by page 10, they're also saying, if this lasts for more than 2 weeks, if you're depressed for more than 2 weeks, you need to see a professional. And then the professional, there's check boxes they fill out now, which is just, if you express a suicidal feeling, you have to be diverted to the psychiatrist. It's a medical issue. It's a liability issue. And so even as we're expanding these kind of more holistic and alternative approaches that are the mainstream system itself is embracing, psychological approaches, psychotherapeutic, even as we're expanding those, we're also been expanding the involuntary commitment system as we go. They become intimately fused right now. And the reason for that, one of the core reasons is people are self-diagnosing now. So I've talked with child psychiatrists who say, I'll have a 10-year-old walk through the door that his parents have brought in, and I'll say, well, so why are you here? And they'll say to me, well, because I got a biochemical imbalance in my brain and I need a drug for it. And it'll be the psychiatrist goes, whoa, wait, let's back up and talk about what's happening at home, right? And so, like, if a good psychiatrist will do that, but not good psychiatrists go, okay, yeah, you probably do, and throw the drug at this kid, right? And so, yeah, we have a problem with that. And as I talk about extensively in the book, unfortunately, these laws are being used for a whole suite of other reasons right now, and that's what's kind of keeping us in the past. They're not really designed to help people. They're not. I know that's the narrative out there, but you could design these laws so differently if that was truly your goal. No, they broadened a lot to give doctors much more power to incarcerate a much broader range of the population. And then we have also these outpatient commitments now where people can be drugged in their own home. That's, again, entirely about social control. They're considered well enough to live on their own in the community, but we don't really want to let them. And so now we keep them permanently tranquilized. And I will say British Columbia has one of the highest rates of doing this in the world from what I've seen. Well, and I'd say it's the highest rate in the world from what I've seen. And so, yeah, it's a huge part of this phenomena. And that's not really about helping people. So now in this context, somebody's basically every day going, I don't like this. It's not helping me. I don't want it. And we're still saying, tough luck for you. We're keeping you drugged no matter what. And this is not a case where people have committed violence and things like that, because they end up in a different system altogether. They're locked up in criminal facilities, those people.
So it's almost like there's like when you described the sort of ceremonial community model or something, it's like we're lacking in community and caring for each other. And so it's like we have these systems that just treat people like just whatever, just to deal with it almost.
Yeah, the medicalization of this system is a big part also of an answer to your question. Why are we stuck in the past? Largely because it's funded through the healthcare system. And at a certain juncture in history, psychiatrists took over mental health in our culture. They are the kingpins. So you can be a psychotherapist, you can be a counselor, and you can even get on staff in some hospitals. You don't have the top level of power. It's always the psychiatrist who's the top level of power under mental health law. And so that's why it is this way, because they're making all the calls in the end. All you would have to do is take the Mental Health Act out of the health framing and make it more like a community health framing. How are we going to help each other as communities to survive? What does supportive housing look like? What does supportive workplace look like? What do these kinds of things look like? How we want to help people outside of a medicalized environment? Well, it would look very different. And that's one of the things. You can get into this. Years ago, right in British Columbia, I saw this playing out where the representative for children and youth had noticed it and wrote an expose on it, which was that the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Children and Families were actually fighting over how to control the whole system, because the doctors on the health side all just wanted to drug these kids, and often the children and youth side were saying no, actually it works better if we don't, and they were at loggerheads, but it was the psychiatrists who always had the control.
Okay. Well, Colin had a question. Do you know if any protesters have been arrested or committed because police deem them mentally unfit?
Yes. In fact, it's an increasingly common problem. And of course, even you or I, if we're at that protest, might not know how we view it. Like a lot of people who do protests, I think an excellent example of that is Trey Arrow, who's famous. You can read about him online. He was written, covered in Rolling Stone, and a very prominent activist in the United States. And because he was so, edgy, right? He was tying himself to trees. He was climbed an office building and slept on a ledge to protest the company that was cutting down the trees. He was doing things like that. A lot of people saw him right off the bat as kind of crazy. He walked barefoot everywhere. I got to meet him because he was incarcerated in a criminal facility in Victoria in British Columbia for a while after he escaped across the border. And so I had opportunity to talk with him directly. And yeah, I mean, he was a person who's profoundly spiritual in many ways. And the latest I heard is that he had been actually had gotten incarcerated under the Mental Health Act. He had gone back to, it's a long story there. Years went by. He was back in the United States and free for a while, but I saw a story about him being on antipsychotic drugs against his will. And so, yeah, the interfaces there are real in some ways. And as a culture, again, we have to say, like, are we going to allow protest? What does protest look like? Even at the political level, look how often now people call Trump insane or call Obama insane. Like if you go online, read right and left commentators, you'll see both sides calling each other insane and really meaning it at times. And I think increasingly we're going to see these laws used in that kind of context. And I specifically address this in the book, actually, too, comparing it to what went on in Soviet Russia. We're not there yet, as far as I can tell, but we are definitely heading in that kind of general direction where it could be very much used as a form of social control against dissidents, I think.
There's a question that relates to that. It was from Julian. It said, how do psychiatric labels shape the way we see ourselves and each other?
Yeah, that's huge, and a long discussion. I guess for the purposes of my work around involuntary commitment specifically, I just say it's very risky to allow yourself to get that label. Like people embrace them a bit now, like, yeah, because it can explain something for a while. It can seem like it's an explanatory thing. There's no actual hard science under this, right? There's no actual way to prove or disprove that somebody has this or that. So it's just a way of saying, yeah, the way I behave or my feelings kind of meet that description. And so I'm going to call myself that for a lot of these mental disorders. And so people can like it for that reason. But I'd say it's very, very dangerous, because once it's on your record, every doctor you see sees it on your medical record. Every police officer, if it's any way it's interacted with the police at any point, it gets on your record there. It's in your social service record. All these records are now being accessed and shared more routinely than ever. You're at risk, because that's the step one criterion for getting locked up, is that you have to have a mental disorder. So if that's already on your record, guess what? You've now met the criterion. They just proceed then to, are you in some way doing something dangerous that we think might be linked to that? So I discourage people from going down that pathway in their lives.
Also, I think your book does a great job of, again, giving voice to people who have this lived experience and do describe in some detail the effect that being labeled has had. And it can, people are describing everything from feeling, deep shame, obviously, humiliation, feeling very disenfranchised. It's a whole host of experiences that typically follow somebody being given a diagnosis and going through these kinds of experiences. So it's a great question.
Oh yeah, and in fact, in some states you're not allowed to vote if you're got a quote unquote mental disability. Like, talk about being in the past. Unequal Rights by Susan Stephan is a great book looking at how once you have a mental disorder label, really all the rights you can lose. The threats, child custody hearings will really swing away from your favor. It's a limitation, I think, on your self-understanding when you impose this upon yourself. That's where I would go. Like, I think it's an unfortunate limitation, and I would affirm more kind of a spiritual approach to understanding, a more artistic approach to understanding yourself and what's happening, that kind of thing.
Well, I hope that many people read your book. Your Consent is Not Required: The Rise in Psychiatric Detentions, Forced Treatment, and Abusive Guardianships. This has been a very important conversation. We've been speaking with Rob Wipond and Rudy Liebig about this new book. And is there any last words you'd like to share before we say goodnight?
I want to thank people for the great questions, and feel free to reach out to me. There's some links, robwipond.com, my own website, some contact information there. I'm also writing regularly with Psych Force Report right now too, so you can check that out. And feel free to reach out if you have any questions or things you want to share, and so on.
Yeah, and I want to thank you, Rob, of course, for the work that you continue to do. And if people do read your book, which I really encourage, and definitely check out Psych Force Report, Psych Force Report TV on YouTube. Really accessible, easy ways to start beginning to open your mind about what the reality of some of this stuff is, and connect with other organizations and people who are really working to raise awareness and bring about some much needed change.
Thank you both. And thank you everyone for coming out tonight.
Thanks,
Thank
Rob.
you.
Thanks, Jacob.
Thanks for joining us for Branches of Wisdom, a podcast of Banyan Books and Sound, Canada's spiritual and healing resource since 1970. Our podcast producer is Jacob Steele. Watch all our conversations on YouTube by searching for Banyan Books, or listen on your favorite podcast platform. Please subscribe, follow, like, and leave your reviews and comments. We love to hear from you. For all our live events, books, and more, visit us at banyan.com.